Mr. Kammer, we're having this conversation as you are retiring from your post of European Department Director, and you have had a long career in the fund, but the change, especially regarding Ukraine, is much broader because Gavin Gray is also reaching the end of his tenure, and the deputy of one of your departments, Uma Ramakrishnan, if I'm Uma is also leaving for another department. So in the light of this situation, I want to ask, who will replace you and how will it affect Ukraine?
So on the first question you asked, who will replace me? I can't give you an answer, but what I can assure you that the changes on our side will not impact on our collaboration, on our support for Ukraine, and simply. What you're seeing is a small part of the team. We have a large team here, and of course, what I should say is when you're looking like a program like Ukraine, this is the largest program in terms of external financing, which the first program had ever in place. Now, with regard to the second program, again, the largest external financing under a program from external donors for any country. This is a large-scale operation in the institution, and I should say it's a whole fund operation. So there are lots of people working on that program, and I'm sure that any of these transitions will have no impact on our capacity on the fund support for Ukraine. There's nothing to worry about.
That's great. You're oversighting the European economy and both Ukrainian economy under this regime. Can you name from 1 to 5 tasks in the action list for your successors?
So when I'm looking at what we are doing here, we are dealing with 46 countries in Europe. And what our oversight starts outside of the US immediately with Greenland. And it goes to the European continent and covers that to the other side of the US. And we are also covering the countries in the south, Turkey and Israel. So it is a large continent, so there are many things to do. Number one priority clearly remains to support Ukraine. We have a new 4-year program in place. Ukraine needs the IMF support. We are an anchor for the donors in order to provide huge financial support over this period. But we are also supporting the Ukrainian government in its reform effort. And we are providing an overall framework so that donors are assured that their money is going to be well spent. The Ukrainian government has in place a structural reform program and a macroeconomic program, which one ensures macro stability, but also on the structural reform side, prepares Ukraine for EU accession, and I should say for a modern Ukrainian state in the medium to long term. So those is our first priority. The second priority, I would say, is supporting all of the countries in Europe during a very difficult period, I would say. When you're looking at the shocks we have been seeing over the last few years, they have been global, they have been deep, they have been many, and they all have become overlapping. And when you're looking at the continent which has been heavily affected by all of these crises, and more than some other, it's Europe. So Europe needs to have that policy-making capacity in place to deal with these enormous shocks, which continue to, I expect, are going to continue to happen in the future. We also need to support the European country in terms of their medium-term growth. For many of the European countries, growth projections for the medium term are dismal. So we are talking about growth which is between 1 and 1.5% every year. That is much lower than what we had in the past. And why do we need higher growth? Well, first of all, higher income is better for living standards. But also Europe wants to maintain social services. They want to maintain the social contract. And we also know that spending pressures are going to increase because of rising aging in society, rising healthcare costs, rising defense costs. And for that, growth is important. Otherwise, fiscal consolidation is a hard thing to do. And so we need to have an agenda for all of the European countries, which is positive on enhancing productivity growth and therefore providing income that will provide fiscal sustainability to provide those services in the future. And last but not least, provides for economic resilience. This is a shock-prone world. Europe is extremely vulnerable because Europe is an open continent for trade. It has been benefiting from globalization and the interconnectedness, but now interconnectedness brings with it risk. We have seen that trade can be weaponized. You have to be very careful about knowing your fragility of supply chain. And sometimes you need to make decisions in order to provide and think about insurance so that these supply chains are remaining stable and cannot be disrupted. And that takes away from efficiency, but it's necessary because the costs of disrupted supply chain can be huge. So those are the two priorities, I would say, the department and the IMF will have in Europe.
It's interesting, just one follow-up, because something that I have never heard IMF mentioning before is the weaponizing of trade. Could you explain in one or two sentences any examples or how does it affect Europe?
Yeah, so what we know is, and that is a world which has seen this before, we have countries being sanctions. We have had disruptions because of export controls, especially when it came to food, when we had food crisis. But we also know that now rare earths are critical. Rare earth exports, imports are rather concentrated. And so that is something to be careful about and to look at. And finally, we see that there's lots of vulnerability with regard to fossil fuel shocks. And Europe is going to be still particularly heavily affected because Europe is a large net importer of fossil fuels. Less so over time, but still very dependent on it. If the Europeans are continuing with decarbonizing energy, if they are continuing with building up the renewables sector, if they are continuing with providing baseload through nuclear, you could foresee a world where Europe becomes independent to some extent from fossil fuels for energy production. And when you're thinking about all of the shocks we have experienced coming from oil and gas, that would be a huge blessing for Europe.
I see. Let's then zoom in Ukraine's performance and also just in one sentence, as your farewell word, how do you evaluate the performance of the IMF, of Ukraine under the IMF program? You have spoken a lot about that, but maybe just one or two sentences to start the topic.
Ukraine has done a fantastic job having reforms under these adverse scenarios. And this was the best performing IMF program we ever had in Ukraine. And I think that's a testament to the seriousness of policymakers. That's a testament to the skills of policymakers. That's a testament to the resilience of the population to doing reforms under these circumstances. And that's a testament to collaboration and solidarity by the international community.
That's brilliant. Then I would like to switch to the new IMF program, which is after the staff level agreement was published, Ukraine faced a drama in parliament connected with the voting for tax legislation. And Kyiv Post also wrote an article that lawmakers were not consulted by both the government and the president, and lawmakers did not understood what they were voting for, and there was a clear miscommunication between the government and the president and lawmakers. Do you think the IMF may have worked more effectively to make sure everyone's on the same page?
So when it comes to program implementation, sometimes this is tough and you meet a rough patch, but you need to overcome that. That's also the strength of how we are engaging, that we are trying to keep programs on track, even if sometimes things do not work quite out as expected. And I would say usually we had this kind of drama also under the old fund program coming from the effects of the war, where we had financing gaps emerging, and we needed to have government action and we needed to have donor actions. This was now a slightly different one with regard to the reform implementation. So what the IMF is doing in general, we are talking to parliamentarians. We want to hear from them on what their views are, what their concerns are, but we are also trying to explain what these reforms are about, why they matter, and why they're good for the population. Even sometimes if some groups don't like them, feel some pain, are resisting them, we are trying to make the case why for the larger population these reforms are welfare enhancing and should be undertaken. And we make this, provide this discussion not only to the governing party, but also to opposition officials. Now, yes.
Then I can ask for a follow-up, because during the last rounds of talks, this was not the mission visit, but the talks, during the last round of talks that were led by Gavin Gray, several opposition party, I have talked with all opposition parties, and they have told me that the IMF did not meet with them, whereas they met with the president's party. Can you elaborate on that?
I can't because I don't have this information. So throughout the program period, we have been meeting with everybody involved, and for us, this is important as part of providing a narrative, providing explanations. But I also should say, where we need to be clear understanding, it is not for the IMF to organize Parliament and to convince Parliament about the necessity of voting yes on these reforms. That is a deeply democratic experience where the government and the Parliament need to get together, and that is not the role of the IMF. I see ourselves in this political spectrum as a neutral, objective, technocratic advisor to explain. But it is for government to make the case to Parliament, and for Parliament to vote, because they have been elected by the people. And therefore it is important that Parliament is supporting the reform effort, and we can't do without Parliament.
Well, yes. Can we then say that it was the government who failed the job?
I don't want to put blame anywhere. When I'm looking at program implementation, when it's successful, we have many parties claiming they're responsible for that success. As I said, we sometimes hit rough patches, and what we need to do, we are overcoming these kind of rough patches. And is there something extraordinary happening? When I'm looking at the history of fund programs in Ukraine, when I'm looking at the history of fund programs across the globe, Absolutely not. We have something very interesting in terms of how we structure programs. We are having quarterly reviews in place. And what is the purpose of these quarterly reviews? The purpose of the quarterly reviews is to make sure if there have been new developments, how we respond to them and adjust the program accordingly. And sometimes we are looking at how to approach things differently if we see that some of the measures have not been working or they could not be implemented on time. What is important, I think, when you're looking at the discussions we had in the new program, de-shadowing the economy is very important. Because in the end, a core part of the Ukraine program is to improve governance. And for that, you need to de-shadow the economy. De-shadowing has also a secondary effect. We need to broaden the tax base, and we need to bring in the informal sector, because too much of that tax burden right now is carried by the formal sector. So we need to bring in that informal sector. And yes, Ukraine not only needs that for EU accession, Ukraine needs that in terms of a modern state who needs to have the financing to provide the social services which its citizens are going to demand. And I think that objective we should never forget. We have many measures in the program. We are trying to increase revenue. We are trying to de-shadow the economy. Those objectives have to be overarching.
I understand that now we're having huge debates on the fiscal side due to the facts that you mentioned. And it's also quite vivid that among the benchmarks, they're mostly the fiscal side and no monetary related, like strict benchmarks. On the other hand, I remember it was very vividly written in the 8th review of the previous program, as far as I remember. And we have recently had this debate about the questions regarding the monetary policy, particularly the foreign exchange. And for 2 years in a row, my colleagues from Bloomberg reported that the IMF is pushing on Ukraine to ease in, to devalue the hryvnia more. And the central bank has given their own answer to this question, but because this was reported more informally, I wanted to ask on the IMF's official stance on this question, whether Ukraine should devalue the hryvnia or not devalue the hryvnia, or what does the IMF officially thinks about it, because rumors are always rumors, and official fact-checking is a part of our job.
Yes. So maybe to bust some myths on that, when it comes to the fiscal side, we have constant discussion on what the limitations are on the spending side. And the Ministry of Finance and government always needs to make hard decisions on that. And we have constant discussions on how to enhance their capacity to collect revenue, because we need a prudent fiscal policy in order to deliver macro stability, but also the services for the Ukrainian population during the war. And these discussions and strict conditionality, that also exists always with the central bank. I would not say that there are no strict targets there. They are there. And the central bank is very focused on meeting those. So when it comes to the exchange rate, what we have been advising, and it's not just Ukraine, but we are advising all countries, when you have a flexible exchange rate, you need to be ready to use that flexible exchange rate as a shock absorber. So that flexibility should be maintained. Fixed exchange rate systems are very difficult to maintain, and they become very costly if you're locking yourself into something. So that's the advantage of having a flexible exchange rate regime in Ukraine. But then you need to also allow the flexibility to take care of absorbing shocks. So that's one part of what we're looking at. A second part of what we're looking at is that Ukraine has a very good foreign exchange reserve buffer. because we have spells of where donor support is coming in not quite on time. We may have external shocks impacting the balance of payments. And for that, again, you need to have the foreign exchange reserves also as a buffer. And therefore, it is important that that buffer is maintained until and unless you are hitting one of these shocks. And overall, this is a discussion of with monetary policy. And you will know very well that the National Bank is very focused on making sure that inflationary pressures, when they emerge, that they are quickly being addressed. I said in the press conference today that in a war period, you have nothing but severe negative supply shocks. So that's putting pressure on the National Bank to manage monetary policy with lots of agility, being timely in their intervention in order to control inflation. And when a negative supply shock increased inflation, to make sure that we don't have any second round effect and any de-anchoring of inflation. And the Ukrainian Central Bank is doing a fantastic job on that front.
I see. So to wrap it up, the Middle East war, the circumstances that we are constantly now talking on the background, which effect do you think it might have on Ukrainian economy, taking into account that previously Ukraine's economy also withstood a harsh winter that could have had any impact on growth?
Yes, and I agree with you. The shock coming from the Middle East is a minor issue, given that the first order impact is the Russian bombing of Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And when I'm looking at what the priorities of the government are, this is not like Western European countries thinking about fiscal support packages to keep protect vulnerable, or to keep prices at the gasoline stations low. Your government is fighting with all its heart and with all its might to be ready for the next heating season, because that is very important, and that is a much what Russia is doing to the energy infrastructure. It's a much bigger shock than what is coming from the Middle East. The risk coming from the Middle East, which is also very clear, is many of other governments are now focused on the war in the Middle East. We haven't seen that they are being distracted by that, focusing on Ukraine. But we also know already on the military side that when it comes to delivery of military goods, that has already been a question mark, since so much of that war material is going to be used up in the Middle East. So there are many risks which could possibly materialize. But in our discussions with the government, what we see is a steadfast view on keeping macro stability, implementing the reforms. And right now on the energy crisis is a real commitment and a focus also in the discussion with donors on reestablishing that infrastructure, on hardening that infrastructure so that it cannot be destroyed anymore. And that is one of the top priorities for the government right now. So the Middle East war is not the severe shock which other countries are experiencing.
I see. Well, we're wrapping it up, but in case you have any last thing that you can pass on to Ukraine, if you want, you can have your minute.
First of all, this is a horrible war. The Ukrainian population is suffering in, and all our sympathies are with the Ukrainian population on this. Second point, the international community is supporting Ukraine, not just on the macro stability, but also in its next steps in terms of having all the conditions in place for a successful EU accession. Final point, we have been working very closely together with a very committed Ukrainian government which wants to achieve these objectives. And for me personally, that was one of the highlights, the collaboration with my Ukrainian counterparts. We always had one objective. We always were looking for good solutions. Even if there were disagreements, we always tried to move forward and find those solutions which we thought was in the best interest of Ukraine. And I want to use this opportunity to thank all of my Ukrainian counterparts in government, but also in the National Bank for their strong support of implementing this program, for their deep seriousness on making all of this a success. And it was a pleasure working with them.
We will pass them the message.